Welcome to the Opera Festival of Chicago's presentation of Behind the Scenes. In this installment, opera dramaturg and famed lecturer Roger Pines, festival music director Emanuele Andrizzi, will take us behind the scenes of Giacomo Puccini's Il Tabarro, which will be presented later this spring by the Opera Festival of Chicago. This presentation is made possible thanks to the generous support of the Italian Cultural Institute of Chicago. We thank them and their director, Luca DeVito. And we're extremely honored to welcome and have the General Consul of Italy in Chicago, Thomas Bozios. Now I'd like to invite the General Consul to make some remarks.
Buonasera, good evening. Thank you, Director Massi. It is a pleasure for me being here at the Roosevelt University College of Performing Arts in this wonderful example of Chicago architecture, the Rudolph Ganz Memorial Hall. Thank you for hosting this conference. I would also like to thank Opera Festival of Chicago and the Italian Government Cultural Institute for organizing this event. A special thanks to Roger Pines and Emanuele Andrizzi, who are going to give us an insight on Giacomo Puccini's opera Il Tabarro, which will be performed next year at the first edition of Opera Festival of Chicago. I'm going to leave them the floor soon, but allow me a very brief remark just to say that if the promotion of Italian culture in general is a key factor of the activity of Italian institutions, doing that in such particular period has an even more important meaning. It gives all of us a sense of the power of culture, the power of going through any difficulties without losing the will or reach out to the public. Also for this reason, the Italian Consulate and Italian Cultural Institute in Chicago, with its director Luca DeVito, fully support the Opera Festival of Chicago in its commendable action to promote Italian culture and the tradition of Italian opera with a multidisciplinary approach. We look forward to gathering soon next year, meeting in person a lot of friends and people to enjoy Il Tabarro and many other masterpieces of Italian artists. Now, without any further delay, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Roger Pines and Maestro Emanuele Andrizzi. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, Roger. I'm so glad we're here tonight to talk about one of the operas that I love the most, and one of the operas that, when I was discussing with my friend Roger, we totally agreed on that should be performed more often. It's one of those masterworks that somehow has not been performed as much as it deserves. Also because there is so much music inside it, and there's so much of late Puccini. And and it's one of the reasons for which really the Opera Festival of Chicago we hope to be able to produce it very soon for you guys. But let's start talking about what this piece is about, Roger. What is the story? How do you see this piece moving on? And what are the important things that Puccini does in it that he didn't do before, and that maybe some people were hoping that he would start doing earlier than waiting for 1918 when it was premiered at the Metropolitan.
The basics of the plot are really pretty simple if you think about it. You have the scene is Paris at the turn of the century, basically, and Michele, who is 50 years old. All of the ages of the characters are very specifically set in the libretto as they were in the original play. Michele is the owner of a barge. His wife Giorgetta is half his age, and she is in love with a longshoreman, Luigi, who works for Michele. He's one of three longshoremen, but they are in love, and of course Michele has no idea. But they're together, all of them, one evening, and Luigi and Giorgetta have a moment where they're able to plan a tryst for that evening, and she goes into the cabin, and Michele looks at her and realizes that once again once again, she is not going to sleep. She's clearly waiting for somebody. Who is it? Who is it? He wonders. And when he sees Luigi come onto the barge, he accuses Luigi. And he says, "You're her lover. You admit it, you love her." And he does. He's forced to admit that, and Michele strangles him. Within seconds, Giorgetta comes out of the cabin, and at one point, I mean, she's very sorry for the things that she said to Michele, and he says, "Come under my cloak," as he used to do. He opens the cloak. There's Luigi's body, throws it out onto the floor of the barge, and throws her on top of it, and that is the end.
Yeah. Very, very fast.
Very fast.
It's one probably the fastest plots to happen. Yet, Puccini makes this opera very interesting by adding other characters. I mean, it's what I've been thinking every time since the first time I worked on this piece was the immediacy that we have in such
yes.
less than 1 hour. All of this happens. Yet, Puccini, is so powerful, to describe and to all of a sudden throw us into a world. I mean, I've always thought, hey, we don't know as much information about like other characters that of previous operas. It's like a window in a specific moment. We don't know at the beginning about this relationship. We don't know about the son that Giorgetta and Michele lost.
But what we do know, I mean, this happens very quickly within the first 5 minutes of the opera. We know that there's incredible tension between
Absolutely.
this husband and this wife.
Absolutely.
And what you get in these conversations, they are not communicating well at all. She says at one point, she says to him, you're good, you're honest, you don't treat me, you don't beat me. You don't beat me.
Right.
But then she says, I would take beating more willingly than these silences, because he's not speaking to her. He's not revealing his feelings to her. And so you get that very early on.
Right. Another thing that I always think is about the fact that there is such a trajectory in between the fact that Michele really doesn't express himself, and we don't know his real thoughts, almost up to the end of the opera.
That's right.
When he sings a piece that starts with Nulla Silenzio. And I'm like, so what are you going to tell us that is so terrible that you've been waiting so long?
He's very quiet through most of the piece, but then when the two of them have their second of their scenes together, he says, why don't you love me anymore? Right. And then you get into the depths of this character, you realize his overwhelming sadness, and then finally you learn that what happened between them was that they lost a child. And because he can only recall those happy days when it was the three of them together. He talks about that Giorgetta and the baby, he had their heads laying on his shoulder or something like that, he says. And he was able to surround them with this cloak of his, the Tabarro.
Right.
And that makes her even sadder and even more uncomfortable with him. But that's probably, it's certainly the most revealing moment that you get from any baritone character in all.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And it's a fantastic moment because it shows all of a sudden why he's been keeping all of that inside his heart. And there's a lot of happening in between because this opera is sort of
divided. Local power.
Absolutely, and there are other characters, and it's magistral. I think the way that Puccini divides this opera into big parts. One in which he presents to us all the characters, all of them. Almost at some point, we almost have almost all of them at once. And then, the second part of the opera in which just the love triangle is there. All the drama is just, all of a sudden in front of us between this, tension between the couple and this parallel love story that she's been having, what we're read at the moment after the second letter, for quite some time. Luigi and Giorgetta are at the point of, almost planning an escape, right?
Very much so. Yeah, it's so interesting that I was talking about the ages before. She's 25.
Right.
He is supposed to be 20. So it's this older woman thing getting into this whole situation.
Yes.
But the only thing, I was thinking about how complete this opera is, that you get so much, these characters, in less than an hour. But the only thing that I wish he had included is something about why these two people got married in the first place. Because she's 25, he's 50. What was it? I was thinking she must have not had a father in her life. Maybe she was raised by a working woman and she never had any sort of father around her. So when this guy came along, maybe he was a friend of the family. She thought, that's my father figure. And of course, he must have been very lovely toward her. So she married him. And he was he was twice her age. Right. So I would love to have had just a little more
background.
Because first of all, Giorgetta does not get a real aria.
She does not.
And that would have been, if I had a subject matter that could have been the content of an aria written for her, that's what I would have wanted to know.
Yeah, but maybe then we would have needed a second and a third act.
Yes.
And but at the same time, I think that within these less than 60 minutes, Puccini gives us so much of his experience by the point. I mean, this is likely the second to last opera that he wrote, and I mean, if we consider the almost overlapping with the Rondine, and the fact that Turandot is unfinished, so he wasn't able to finish to orchestrate it. So Puccini at this moment is really a master.
Oh yeah.
And yet I mean, so many things happen, and that made him think about writing this kind of opera and going toward a direction that is sort of unusual for the time, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, he had a very complex relationship with the Ricordi publishing house, with Giulio Ricordi, and then after his death, Giulio's son Tito. And so the two of them, Giulio and Tito, had really no desire to see Puccini write a triple bill at all, because they felt that it had, number one, it had no box office appeal, and number two, they were very concerned that these pieces it was such a big deal to perform them together. It was so expensive that they envisioned that opera houses would just do one of the Trittico pieces, and the other one or two, if it were double bill or triple bill, would not be pieces by Puccini. Therefore, they would make as much money.
Which is somehow what happened, in later years.
Yes.
After, they were split and, put together with so many other operas, right?
It's been done. I counted 5, and then you added another, so 6 different possible pieces that Tabarro has been done with, separated from Trittico. But in any case, so there was this triple bill that Puccini thought that the effort of writing this wouldn't be quite as taxing for him as writing a whole huge full-scale piece. And he also was having trouble concentrating. I mean, it had been 4 years, but still, he was very emotionally distraught because 4 years before, the family maid had been accused by Puccini's wife of adultery with Puccini and had been so harassed by the wife that she had committed suicide. And that was an enormous scandal, and it scarred him forever. So even 4 years later, he was having trouble focusing. And he thought maybe these 3 individual operas would be more manageable than one huge piece.
Totally. And I think that by the point also, Puccini had mastered so much, yet the art of the voice. And so it was something that I wanted to discuss with you, because we are talking about assimilated, of course, what had been all the Italian tradition, but he had gone also further. But what I'd like first to talk with you was how do you put all these characters that appear in this opera, in particular in Tabarro, in contrast and in relationship with other operas of the time? I mean, if there is some particular voices that are, very well used in this opera, and how does Puccini goes into, giving that debate. I mean, Puccini, like many composers, wrote for specific people, didn't he?
In this case, I wouldn't think that that would have been foremost in his mind, but certainly he had an idea of what the vocal characteristics of previous roles were. For example, here we are. Madame Butterfly and Tosca are generally operas that somebody singing Giorgetta would do. So in other words, it's been done by fairly heavy lyric voices, but mainly by spinto voices. More often Toscas than butterflies, although there have been some very well-known butterflies that have done it, but also I can think of a couple of Wagnerian sopranos who have done it as well. The point is to have a soprano voice with a very substantial lower middle register, which is where most of the music lies. Yeah, she has a high C, but it's an optional note. So it's you have to have great substance in the middle of the voice, which of course any Tosca and any butterfly as well would need. So that's the substance of sound that's needed for the role of Giorgetta. And as far as the tenor singing the role of Luigi goes, it's generally somebody who would sing the role of Cavaradossi in Tosca. A real spinto tenor with a lot of strength at the very top of the voice, because in the climaxes of the role of Luigi, you have Puccini working the voice very aggressively indeed.
Absolutely.
Really sitting on right above the staff and over a very powerful orchestra. So that requires a considerable power, and the same thing is true at the end of his aria, where you need a really pile-driving kind of high D flat.
Yes.
Again, over a very large Puccini orchestra. So somebody who's able to deal very easily with the heaviest moments of so now I was about to say, somebody who can deal with very easily with the heaviest moments of not just Cavaradossi, but of something like Ravanese.
Ravanese, exactly.
Yes. Then, here we are with our baritone. I think just about every Michele has been a Rigoletto.
I agree with you.
Yeah. Because you need tremendous control, you need power, of course, you need the reserves to take a high G at the end of his big aria, which again, huge orchestra behind him. So, and if he hasn't been a Rigoletto, then he's absolutely been a Scarpia.
At least. Right.
Yeah, I'm thinking of all the major Micheles, I think they've all sung Scarpias.
And I'm glad, what you mentioned, about the fact that these voices in Puccini, go often, in contrast with such a big orchestra. And I mean, it's, there's been, so much comparison between, what Puccini took, from Verdi, from Wagner. And I think that if one thing, we can, assume from, all, this comparison is really the fact that Puccini treats, even more than Wagner, the orchestra as a character and the characters as instruments. And yet, the main difference for me as an Italian, in my Italian years, is always the fact that the voice in Wagner, somehow becomes part of the musical content. So it's like as if it was an instrument for the orchestra. Puccini goes a little bit further in what Puccini does very subtle use of orchestration to all of a sudden make us aware of the fact that there is this orchestra and it comes with all of its force. We'll see it later when we see the end of the duet, between the second duet between Luigi and Giorgetta. Yeah. And there's one of these moments like, in the middle of Si chiamano Willy. And then at that moment in which you have the violins and W, you feel like, okay, this is so powerful. And I think that has been also one of the reasons for which, unfortunately, Puccini's music has been diminished so many times. I mean, in Italy, there's been all this critical thinking about Puccini being too much like Hollywood, Puccini being like a sort of pre-movie music writer. And instead, I think that Puccini is so capable of really taking Verdi and Wagner and putting them to a further dimension, because by that point, society had changed. society, we learn what, composers were thinking. And that's why, Puccini became a favorite of his age, didn't he?
Oh, unquestionably. He was the most popular composer for the stage in the world at the time, because he understood what the public would accept. And we were talking about power in the voice before, but I want to make sure that we emphasize that he was a superb creator of conversation through music. And this is a perfect piece to talk about.
Yeah.
You need singers who, in talking about the qualities of a Puccini voice, yes, the voice needs thrust, yes, the voice needs power, the voice needs quite a variety of color, but above all, a Puccini singer needs to understand how to create conversation. There is so much of it in this piece, whether it's between Luigi and Giorgetta in that duet, whether it's between Michele and Giorgetta at the beginning of the opera, where we're first getting to know them. So what I have a problem with listening to this piece is performances where they all speak to each other as if they're at a public meeting, there's so much intimacy that's possible, and it's not just the singers that have to understand that, the conductor has to understand that, and scale things in such a way so that these conversations can be heard and appreciated by the audience.
Yes. And it's a great point you're making, also because I think that, as you say, Puccini by this point is so wise, and the orchestration that he writes is really perfectly, fitting, this, Puccini is one of those composers that, if you know how to use the orchestra, never covers the singers, but makes the singers, feel really like, okay, this is your stage, I'm helping you. And, it creates this sort of powerful moments, even with just a very subtle orchestration. You think about the beginning, when we see, those pizzicati, the deep, the same river. And I agree with you. It's conductors need to understand that when there is this powerful orchestra doesn't have to take over the stage, but needs to help the stage, right?
Yeah, he doesn't make it easy.
He does. He does.
We were talking before about the role of Giorgetta and what a substantial middle voice she needs. Well, there's that moment at the beginning of that little section that she and Luigi sing together, the big unison passage.
With the bell village.
Yes, where she starts off, it's a big orchestra, she has to start off right in the middle of her voice. And you need some real thrust in the middle to get over that.
I agree. But that goes back to the point, you were saying that one of the first Giorgettas was it's someone that used to sing Wagner. So I really see the point of the power of voice, the fact of knowing that his singers would have both that power and those qualities. What you're saying about the parlato really makes me think about the evolution that parlato has had by this point. Of course, many of us know, but by the time of Puccini, we don't have practically almost any more recitatives. So, the recitative was, the way to carry the action in between arias or concertati, rather, parts in which, singers would sing more. And yet, there were those parts in which the plot would need to move. Puccini does it in a different way, doesn't he?
Well, it's still recitative. It's just that it's recitative that veers to, the word I always use is arioso.
Right.
Yeah, which is halfway between. That's what he is able to create in all, from the very beginning.
Yes.
Yeah, and by the time he got to Tabarro, he knew exactly how to characterize through conversation, through musical conversation. And what's wonderful is that he gives everybody in Tabarro, he gives them their own particular musical language, that's one of the things that's most satisfying. You listen to the mezzo-soprano, La Frugula, when you listen to her sing her arietta, there's no way that Giorgetta would have sung in that style.
Absolutely.
And then when you listen to Luigi, and you get this smoldering quality that he has with these enormous phrases toward the end of his aria, that's language musically that belongs so completely to him.
Yeah.
And one favorite moment of mine, and this is perfect example of music getting close to it, an arioso feeling. The first high note that you get from Giorgetta comes fairly early on, but do you remember what she's talking about? She's talking about the moon and how it's rising like, is it the moon or the sun? Wait a minute. The moon. It's the moon. And it's rising like a great orange over the sky. And it seems such a mundane image for this glorious rising phrase that she has. So that's in the middle of what had previously been recitative, and suddenly she breaks out into this long lyrical line. That's what he's able to do. And the thing is, he's not, if it had been a composer writing 50 years before, that would have been a signal for him.
Absolutely.
Well, this is not what Puccini is interested in.
Yeah.
So you get this one moment of lyrical outpouring, and then we're back into the conversational feeling. This is what's so brilliant about Tabarro.
And it goes back and forth. It's all the time there is this tension between the moment in which the conversation goes to a moment in which there is self-reflection, and then goes back to the conversation. Yes. And as we'll see later, those magical moments of theater in theater, like the moment in which we have the song seller in the middle of the little the discussion between Giorgetta and Michele. But this brings up something really interesting, which is it's based on a play, La Blonde, by Didier Gold, that Puccini saw in Paris in 1912, and he wrote to, I believe, to his librettist, and it pleased him, the play. I mean, it was, of course, a horror story in a way. So he admired the drama of it, but he said that there needed to be contrast with the blood. He couldn't be unrelievedly dark. And as a result, you have these fantastic contrasts in Tabarro, where where we have a very tense conversation between Michele and Giorgetta, at the same time, the song seller is singing over on shore. And this lovely, lilting, sweet melody, and meanwhile, it's so tense. Right. So you get that juxtapose, and that he was able to create perfectly. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that also one thing that I find very interesting in this piece is that how he's able, of course, with the help of Adam, his librettist, but also by understanding the original French plot, how he's able to use by this moment this idea of verismo. I start thinking back to verismo, how it was used by the earlier composers of verismo. So verismo was this the Italian equivalent of the French realism. So stories that were just supposed to describe the life as it is, without having the big heroes, the big long stories. But stories mostly from the lower milieu, from the
common people.
Absolutely, from common people. And all of a sudden Puccini takes on one of these stories. And I think that probably Puccini was the last to take on verismo, wasn't he? And I see this such an arrival point in Tabarro, because the use of parlato that he has in Tabarro really brings me to this idea of bending the art to understanding what the people is talking about.
Why don't you explain to listeners what parlando is all about?
Yeah, so it's particularly Puccini tried in many of his operas, and at some point also in Gianni will actually go to actually have Gianni it's realistic. But all the idea of parlando in Puccini comes from a desire to give the word the power that it has. And in Tabarro, we are in a point in which really there is such a confusion, such a melting between what is to be sung, what is to be sung with an ideal of just expressing the real word. And it goes really back to what the first writers of verismo had decided to do. Even since the development at the end of the 19th century with Poito, and then with Pirandello and Verga, it was all about describing what these people were talking about and how they were using language. And and it was such a break with what happened before. Before, at the time of Verdi or of the romances of the 19th century, it's all about heroes and all about beautiful stories, all about the power of the melodrama. By the time of Puccini, it's completely changed the environment. It's all about telling that, hey, we live in a bourgeois moment, and this is not how regular people speak. And isn't that fantastic the way he uses the language to even the melody. I always thought that the melodies of the beginning of Tabarro are so somehow very, very simple, very easy, and that's why, because it's describing all these people from the social media. Don't you think so? When I hear Frugola, talk and think, I feel like, okay, this is such an easy melody. And the words are so easy.
The melodies are straightforward. It's the harmony that gives you the complexity.
Absolutely.
But we talked. I heard you talking about language before. I've read this libretto over and over again, and what strikes me constantly is the total naturalness of the way people converse, and they're speaking frequently about very ordinary things, and so you cannot deliver these roles, it seems to me, on stage without a total connection to the natural accent of the word.
And understand it.
Oh, it so helps in this piece to be native Italian, because these words have to be formed. A lot of these lines are just sort of thrown off in conversation, but that's a very particular ability that the singer needs. You can't, there are a lot of people in recordings of Tabarro that are guilty, I think, in a way of singing too much. That they make too much of some of those lines that really do need to just be thrown off in a casual way, the way you would in normal conversation. That's a particular ability.
It is. And in fact, I was thinking, while we were talking about the various recordings of this piece.
Yes.
And one thing that really strikes me is still, and I've seen so many of these videos from the early 20th century. It's really the difference between how we sing this music today and how it used to be sung. Don't you think so? Particularly, the attention that sometimes, these people that were, just sons of those that sang with Puccini, the care that they had, for certain things in parlato. They're recording with the clarinetella. It's unbelievable because nowadays you always think.
It's from 70 years ago.
Exactly, and nowadays I remember the first time I went with my at the time fiancée to see one of the operas in Italian. She's Italian, and she was like, yeah, but I don't understand what the soprano is saying. And I was like, well, unfortunately, this is one of the things that unfortunately have become part of singing in so many schools. And then you go back and you hear the importance of the word. And if you think about all the fights that Verdi had with the people on stage, with singers, conductors, and then moving on to Puccini about understanding the text. Don't you think that it's such a big concern that people should have nowadays when thinking about how do you make sure that it's so understandable and so clear as Puccini would have wanted.
You get people within our own time who have this. Renata Scotto being a perfect example, and she was, of course, a great Giorgetto. But that's the rarity. Whereas you go back to the sopranos and tenors of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and you get what the great soprano of 75 years ago, Lucia Albanese, referred to as l'accento. Mm-hmm. And this is what was so completely essential. She didn't have a large voice, but she was able to put the music across through concentrating on shaping the text meaningfully and precisely. That's what did it. That's what projected it. And there were so many examples just like that. one of my absolute favorite Italian singers is the soprano Tabarro.
Oh,
and when you listen to her sing anything in Italian, she was recording in the 1930s and 40s, you hear the words as if you have never heard them before. Because they were trained at that time that the word, I mean, frequently tone was sacrificed to text. But it makes music live, this kind of involvement that these singers of her generation had in getting the text across. I mean, do you feel that that's an art that has been lost among Italian singers?
You know, I think that, you know, there's, we think a lot about it, but we don't do enough, you know, to go back to those origins. I think that somehow we become so obsessed by, you know, having voices that can go further in big theaters, rather than having voices that can project. And that what we were saying about Albanese, you know, one of these things, Pedrella, all of those people that could carry, you know, not just the sound, but the articulation of the sound over to the gallery. And which is what, you know, makes, you know, up to the 50s and 60s, you know, still, you know, with Callas and Tebaldi, I mean, it's, you know, and but I think that after that, and after Scott, things somehow changed, and, you know...
We're just talking about sopranos now, but we should really be talking about other voice types.
You're totally right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it goes for all voice types. The further back you go in the history of recording, the more, and this does not just apply to Italian singing, it applies to French singing, German singing. There was an incredible awareness of text. Yeah. And the importance of text, that, you know, what textual nuance was about, and it made all the difference in the world.
All the difference, I totally agree with you. Let's talk a little bit, Roger, about how this opera came about. I mean, you know, you told us a little bit before, you know, all these, the problems that Puccini, by now, you know, we have to remind you know, our friends that, you know, by the time, you know, he started writing Tabarro, Puccini was in the last decade of his life, because, you know, Tabarro at the end was finished in 1916, premiered in 18, and Puccini died in 1924. So it's already a composer that is at the height of the success, known all over the world, yet struggling to write something new or something at all. So what happened, you know, and what happened, and how long did it last? Because I mean, you know, since Tosca, Madame Butterfly, and then moving on until Fanciulla of the West, you know, it starts getting slower and slower to write music, doesn't it?
It took him so long to find subject matter that he was interested in. I mean, it was a desperate struggle for him, as much as it was with Verdi. And he had started to think about the whole idea of a triptych, of 3 one-act operas, as far back as 1900, which was Tosca. And his original idea was to have a trio based on Dante. But he moved from that into another idea, that he would take one acts of the playwright Maxime Gorky and create a triptych out of that, and that didn't amount to very much. So he goes past, you have Fanciulla of the West, 1910, and then this terrible scandal that I was mentioning before, so he wasn't writing very much at that time. And so finally, he also, the whole idea of a triptych was very much objected to by his publisher, Ricordi. And so after Giulio Ricordi died, in I believe 1913, the path was sort of clear, if Puccini wanted to try the triptych. And he started to write it, but then was interrupted because of La Rondine, which was a commission that he had in Vienna. It wound up being premiered in Monte Carlo rather than Vienna for some complicated reasons. But once Rondine was out of the way, he was able to get back to Tabarro, the first of the 3, and he had librettist problems. He had a very old librettist, Ferdinando Martini was his name, who gave him some very old-fashioned verses that really didn't fit this whole milieu of working-class Paris at all. So Martini was then out of the picture, and he went to Giuseppe Adami, with whom he
even tried the first with Ilica, didn't he?
I don't think so. I think Adami came in.
I think that they tried first with Ilica, then with Martini.
Ilica didn't work out.
Yeah.
But in any case, Adami gave him what he wanted, but with a lot of criticism along the way. The first version that he gave Puccini was really fairly unsatisfactory. He said he wanted something with more heart.
Right.
Yeah, he thought it was quite dull, and so eventually this libretto was finished. The other two libretti for the Trittico were written by Gioacchino Forzano, and that was for Angelica and Gianni Schicchi. He originally wanted the piece to be done in Rome, but World War I wasn't even over yet at the time, so and it was impossible to put a production together. Right. It just wasn't feasible. And so it wound up being premiered at the Metropolitan Opera in 1918 with an incredibly starry cast. And it was not exactly a triumph. Well, Gianni Schicchi was. Gianni Schicchi, some of the critics were saying this is the most delightful comedy that we've ever had on the stage of the Met. But Tabarro, and especially Suor Angelica, people had decidedly mixed feelings about it.
Don't you think that maybe it might have been also because, having something so dark at the moment in which, people were so tired at the end of the First World War, people needed something more somehow jolly, somehow, a commedia rather than, another big dramatic piece and a piece of introspection and seeing like Suor Angelica somehow.
I wanted to give you actually a quote, because remember this was Tabarro was based on La Lutte, which was Grand Guignol,
right,
which was,
splatter all the time.
Play blood, horror, this kind of thing. So what one of the New York critics said was, it is after La Lutte by Diego, after it, but certainly not far behind it in horror and repulsiveness.
Wow.
It is all a sullen, silent struggle of ill-tempered wills. And the music was not particularly well-liked either to Tabarro, because what they were expecting was butterfly.
Of course.
That's what they wanted this piece to sound like. They were very blind and deaf to what Puccini was capable of. So, Schicchi was just total joy, and of course, all the critics were delighted with it. But no, Tabarro took a long time to really find its feet. Suor Angelica took that much longer. So it went to Rome, and same critical response the following year. And then it went to London, premiere there, same response again. So it just, for audiences and critics to accept Il Trittico as all the piece, it was a long time coming.
It was indeed. And also I think that it was very interesting to see that, I remember when I was reading about the Met premiere, I was expecting, of course, to see someone like Toscanini to conduct it.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, it did not happen. So, what happened? Since Toscanini was probably the most powerful and probably most known Italian conductor at the time, in the world, and it was so.
Well, their relationship was very rocky,
wasn't it?
Yes, and especially in this period of between Fanciulla, the 1910s, that decade, and they patched it up eventually. Toscanini, of course, conducted the premiere of Turandot.
He did.
But at this time of the Trittico, there was no question. I mean, Toscanini wasn't going to conduct.
Yeah, it's always fun to read all these stories. Like I told you, that there was a moment in which Puccini sent by mistake, panettone, one of these bread that Italians make for Christmas. He sent it to Toscanini along, with many other friends. And then, he realized to send this to Toscanini in a moment in which they were enemies, because, they were friends. So every other year they were going back and forth between being best friends and being best enemies. And then Toscanini writes a telegram saying, sorry, sent by mistake. And Toscanini replies saying, sorry, eaten by mistake. Which, tells all the story, I think, about, this relationship? Because I mean, it was two pretty strong characters.
Very strong characters. Yeah, it just, things were very tough between them, and it's fascinating to read what went on because they both were they had such power.
They did.
They were the two most, along with, first Giulio and then Tito Ricordi, they were the most powerful personalities in Italian music at the time. So when things clashed, it was really very serious and very personal. And so it was unfortunate that Toscanini didn't conduct the premiere.
It was indeed. Talking about what happened after that premiere, I mean, it's one of the things that we think nowadays is how operas change, since their inception. How the direction and the directors, decide to interpret, operas, to review them. So I was wondering, if you can, give us a little bit of an idea of the different many ways in which this opera has been, interpreted in terms of staging and how it develops.
I don't think Tabarro has been as much subjected to crazy stagings over the decades as Tosca has, as Butterfly and Turandot have. And I think one reason is that Puccini and, Adami, librettist, they are so specific about what this whole milieu is. Every little detail is there. What the barge looks like, how big it is, what the background should be, that Notre Dame should be visible in the distance, that Parisian apartment buildings should be visible as well, what the lighting should be like, all the details on the barge, what the cabin looks like. It's all there. It's all in the libretto. And so I've never had any desire to see any Tabarro that wasn't realistically presented. I think that's what's desired. Yeah. So all I can think of is that as far as the way it's been shown on stage over the decades, is that some productions have chosen to give just an impression of a barge, a very stark realization of a barge with nothing of Paris in the background. And the only advantage there, it seems to me, is that you're forced to concentrate on characters. But then, if you're going to do it that way, you need people whose personalities on stage are so expansive and so communicative that they fill the stage.
And they make us believe, what they're singing about.
So I don't think Tabarro is one where we instantly think of strange visions of it over the decades. I don't think that really has happened that much, and I think people have been wise to take as realistic approach as possible to it. Mind you, when you have a stage like you have at the Met, which is such a grand scale space, you can do things like there's in their most recent production, there's a huge bridge that one ascends and crosses over to shore that not every theater would be able to do. And there's also an enormous facade on shore of, I think, a factory that goes way upstage, and it's very imposing. And so it just depends on your resources. But I like seeing the barge take up practically the entire stage, because you need to believe that it's a convincing living space for Michele and Giorgetta. You need a cabin that one can actually go into. And he's supposed to look through the window of the cabin later in the opera and see her. See her sitting there waiting for somebody. You have to believe in all of that.
And also I think that it's so important that we see this, the barge and what happens, on the land, because I think that all this opera is also built in this dualism that was, between, living on the same river and living on the land. Giorgetta has this desire to go back to land.
Yes.
As she says over and over, she decides, when she talks, with the Luigi.
I don't like this nomadic life.
Absolutely. And instead Michele loves to be in the boat, and practically he never leaves this boat. And if you like, it's a sort of a self-imposed imprisonment. So, and somehow because he likes that, and it's all of the drama is between this contrast of deciding whether to keep doing a nomadic life and to have another kind of life, which probably Giorgetto's view was to be in Paris and have fun there, frugulence, was having the little home in the suburbs or whatever, which brings me to the idea of the theme. So what Puccini takes from Verdi, of course, but what he wants to describe with his music, and tinte means literally means colors or variations of colors in Italian. Yet what since Verdi, what they meant was the characterization of the opera, and to make us believe that what they're saying makes sense. I remember one of these quotes from Puccini saying that for him the most difficult thing about writing an opera was to write the first page, because it was when he would need to convince me that I was actually there. And then the rest of the opera would come easy, because once he had realized how to express with music, the milieu, the location, the characters, everything would flow. So what do you think that it's the theme that in this opera, how you put it within the production that Puccini brought up to that point?
Well, there is this milieu that needs to be created and we need to believe in, and that is the milieu of working class people.
Absolutely.
In Paris at that time. And how is he going to... also, working class people who, in some cases, are very downtrodden. If you think about what Luigi is singing about, he's talking about you bend your back and you work non-stop and you work for low wages and you struggle every minute of your life, and that's what it is. That's what we're doing. Yes.
Hold your head and bend your back.
That's right. Bow your head and just nose to nose always. And so that's a kind, you need a certain darkness to the piece for that kind of sentiment. So it's predominantly, it's a dark piece musically. It's in minor keys almost all the time, and that's why. Even if you're talking about Frugula and her little arietta, it's all in a minor key. This is the character who basically is bringing life into the show, and yet she's singing consistently in a minor key all the way through. And then when she and her husband are singing when they're exiting, same thing. So that's why when after Frugula talks about the kind of life that she would like to have, that she wants a little house somewhere where she can put her feet up and be with her cat. What Giorgetta says, my dream is something completely different. And then suddenly the music turns major. And that is, to me, that's the great moment in the piece.
I agree.
It's this ray of light. And through Giorgetta's whole aria-like passage, where she's talking about what it was like to grow up in Belleville and how she has this devotion to it, to Paris, and she gets very nostalgic. That's all in major. So that's such an extraordinary contrast with like 90% everything else. So yes, it is predominantly dark, and there's so much harmonic ambiguity through it, and that is so significant because when you're talking about the whole Giorgetta-Michele relationship, that's a very unsettled feeling that you get between them. You don't really need harmony that's easy and straightforward. That's not really going to help things dramatically. You need this constant ambiguity about it. I love there's also a moment where the organ grinder comes onto the barge and is accompanying the dancing that's going on between Giorgetta and the longshoremen. And it's very... Puccini, I think, wants the organ to sound out of tune.
Yes, and it was all silence.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
It is.
So that's a great moment that really is quite revealing, I think. But yeah, it's absolutely a very dark piece almost throughout, and which makes you doubly grateful for these major episodes, these major key episodes like I was talking about.
And also, as you were saying before, I always think about the fact that these harmonies are so complex, and yet, particularly in the first half, these melodies are so easy. And somehow it makes me think about all this criticism that it was so unfortunate to receive. Everybody, particularly in Italy at the time, with Torre Franca and all these critics, they were always blaming Puccini for writing melodies that were too good, but somehow too easy, as opposed to somehow very. And I've always felt that, Puccini was such a great composer, because it wasn't just about the melody. As you were saying before, he describes the characters so, just in their three-dimensionality. Because, we hear this melody, and yet we hear the orchestra depicting, underneath the struggles that they live through.
That's right.
Frugola sings about the cat, sings about this house in the suburbs, and as you're saying, the music tells us something completely different. It sounds like, is something going to happen to Frugola at this point? Nothing has happened. She's just telling us a story, saying, she hopes, that her husband is not going to get drunk again. So it's all this unsettling thing, but it's just, regular people talking about regular life, yet the music goes deeper.
There's another really important quote from one of those first reviews in New York in 1918. It's talking about neither in this opera nor the other two which follow was there more than an occasional vestige of the sustained melody which, like a heady, even if light wine, characterizes Butterfly.
There you go.
So they just couldn't, they weren't willing to give him a break. At least not in Tabarro's Sforzata. This is what they were expecting. So I didn't go back to the Fanciulla reviews, but I think Fanciulla must have been carried in New York by this astounding trio of singers who created the leading roles, and they were just, it was going to be sort of an automatic success because of their presence. Yeah, but here was a composer trying something radically different, and he was writing also about the kind of, he had written about this kind of person before. Right. That was new to him too, and that's not what people would have expected. This was a whole working class environment. People would have associated him with that.
Yeah. And I think that also, writing in that direction is so big the break. As we were talking, describing before, the times had changed, between the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century to after the First World War. And so I think that also Puccini changes with that. So we go from these idealized, women usually, like Mimi, and it's all this idea of the angelical woman that is from Petrarca in Dante. So it's in the Italian literature, for centuries and centuries. And all of a sudden, it goes to something completely different. It's even the women of the later operas. Mimi is a sort of threshold because I would say that he tries with me to go somewhere, and yet he sort of finishes with a happy ending that people were somehow expecting from him. But then it goes into Giorgetta, into Frugola, and the role of the woman in Puccini has changed completely. This is because the times and the society had changed, and there were not more those heroic times in which we would think about the myths. It was the times in which we're talking about the people, those who are there trying to make ends meet, and to make it to the end of the day, actually, because that's what this is all about. I mean, when Michele and Giorgetta at the beginning are talking about who to live in Paris when they live with the Pope, isn't it somehow all like, okay, so which is the one of the scapegoat that we're going to abandon to his destiny? And I think like, okay, this is such a big jump, from just even 2 years earlier with Lanone, which is all about, this sort of aristocratic life. Here there's no more aristocracy. No. This is the world post-World War I. And it's as you were saying before, the beginning of this triptych, this is the hell of the three. If you see the as if the Divine Comedy with the hell, the purgatory, and the paradise. Yes. And this is really hell, and that's hell for someone who lived with aristocrats and in the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. It's all in the popular world, isn't it?
What's really interesting is in the original play, the character of Louis, who becomes Luigi, is comparatively mild, and Georgette seduces him. And this is not the way it happens in the opera. Giorgetta is quite different. Giorgetta is much more complicated and much more sympathetic. And so, I don't remember who I was reading on the subject of Tabarro, but talked about the character of Louis in the original play, and Luigi, by comparison, seeming like a Marxist fanatic in his sentiments about the life of the worker.
Absolutely.
But these are not sentiments that people associated with a character in Puccini, really at all.
And that's why maybe probably they for so many years they decided to put somehow Tabarro and somehow also Suor Angelica aside, isn't it? Because people want to see Puccini associated with Madame Butterfly, with Mimi, with Tosca.
Tabarro has been done with Pagliacci. It's been done with Cavalleria Rusticana, and that's a very heavy duty.
It is.
If you think about either one of those. If you have a star Giorgetta, and she is somebody who is worth doing Poulenc's La Varumène for, then that could be quite a tour de force, because La Varumène is an opera for one person.
Of course.
So that's been done. You had mentioned to me Zemlinsky's Florentine Tragedy, which do you remember what the company was who did that? That's really astonishing to me. But that's a love triangle.
It is.
Yeah. So, okay.
And also that connection. The connection is also that Puccini originally was thinking about doing Oscar Wilde's novel in a Florentine Tragedy as part of the triptych. So maybe that's why also the association.
And then I just found out this morning that when San Francisco did Tabarro in 1971, they paired it with Carmina Burana.
Wow,
so that's quite a contrast as well. So that when you take Tabarro out of the Trittico, you could do it that way. And also, Tabarro has on occasion actually been paired with Suor Angelica, with no speaking.
Wow, very dark here.
But they really...
And no redemption.
Yeah, but they belong together. They really must be performed together. I remember thinking how completely revelatory it was when I finally got to see a full Trittico on the stage. It's a huge undertaking for an opera company. These are three very different operas. They have especially Schicchi and Suor Angelica have big casts. Yeah, and even though there's only a little bit of chorus in Tabarro and just women in Suor Angelica and no chorus in Schicchi, still, it's a huge challenge. And so what I was saying before, Ricordi was really reluctant to have the Trittico written in the first place because he didn't want to see these operas done separately. And Puccini didn't either.
He did, right.
But he finally resigned himself to the fact that this was going to happen. And that they were going to be done separately because it was, he thought, ultimately too large an undertaking for most opera.
It is. Why don't we play some scenes, from Tabarro, so that, we show our friends what we're talking about, also with some music.
Oh, are we going to do the opening? Because what's really important to know is that the curtain is supposed to rise before the music starts. Puccini and Adami wanted that vision of the scene to be taken in by the audience before the prelude began.
Interesting, isn't it? To start an opera inside.
Yes.
Incredible, just this beginning. I mean, you all of a sudden you feel right away.
You're there. You really feel that you're absolutely there.
The waves and the irregularity of the barge being pushed toward
and that the music rises at one point and then within seconds it's falling again.
That's fantastic, I think.
Yeah, the atmosphere is really distinctive.
And I felt also, what you were saying before about this invitation to start the opera with the scene already, with the open curtain. It creates this expectation. First it gives us the image, and then all of a sudden, while we start imagining what might come right after, then Puccini says, "Let me help you with that," isn't it? Mm. So I feel like, okay, that's how you would describe, something like that with music.
And through all of that, you have very specific things in the libretto of what is going on with the longshoremen, that they're loaded bags and everything. And Giorgetta is taking clothes off the clothesline. There's very basic activities happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And even up to hearing the sign and
yes.
Later on there is the horn of a car. So sorry, let us go to the next one. And this is just right after the very first beginning. Let's see what happens between Giorgetta and Michele, her husband, 25 years older than she is.
Scelate.
Lo sapete, tu non mi batti.
Primavera, non cercare voi due amanti tra l'ombre della sera.
E vedi per tosse.
Primavera, chi ha vissuto per amore si morì. La storia dimmi
a me dunque hai
nulla chi aspettando sa che muore con l'amore le giornate con i fatti e si capisce perché l'amore le giornate ma l'amante non portò e i suoi fatti anche cuore dimmi.
That's a wonderful moment, isn't it?
Well, I think, I can just imagine how the audience at the premiere must have responded, because that is, of course, a quote from the Chiamano Mimi in Bohème, and probably everybody just went, ooh, you know, because it was just the shock of recognition, because the song seller is actually singing about a character named Mimi, and Puccini very cleverly thought that allusion to the Bohème probably would bring a smile to the audience. But this is the contrast that I was talking about before, because this is Giorgetta saying to him, while the song vendor is off there in the distance selling his wares, there's Giorgetta saying, what's going on with you, Michele? You're not talking to me. And then they talk about the fact that he doesn't beat her, and she says, I would prefer that to the silence.
Right.
So this incredible tension, well, this sweetness is happening, you know, a few yards away.
It is one of those moments in which, teatro nel teatro, they call it in Italy, so theater within the theater. So, all of a sudden you see, it's the real life. I mean, you're there, having an argument with your partner, and just in the street, the kids are playing soccer. So it's the same thing, So you see they having this big discussion, and yet, underneath, there is all this completely different scenario. I mean, the guy that is selling the song, and also, the big reference, to me, the primavera, so spring. So we think about when Mimi talks about, quando gets those jets, which is primavera.
It's
and,
you hear touch
those 4 notes, and you're like, okay, wait a second, is this Tabarro, or am I back to Bohème?
But it probably created a certain comfort level in the audience, because he was just so clever in making that decision. It fit in perfectly.
Absolutely. Let's move a little bit on, with the next moment, and it's one of the fun moments of the opera, although.
And we should mention that this is sort of unusual in Puccini, because when you think of Puccini, you don't think of mezzo-sopranos. Yeah, and so the fact that he has a mezzo-soprano featured in all of the Trittico operas was significant. And Frugula is so interesting. She shouldn't be too young, but she shouldn't be ancient. She should be somewhere, just middle-aged, and with the kind of voice that maybe a few years before would have sung on Menace Night. You need that kind of thrust for the climax of this aria. And you need a lot of color in it. And you also need real acting chops. This can be, if acted well, it can be one of the gems of the Trittico. Because she's a type. She's very energetic and resourceful, but she's also a little eccentric. And I just find her adorable.
Absolutely. Let's play a little bit for our audience here.
You need to project those words. And that tempo is actually fairly manageable. There are some recordings I've listened to where the arietta goes like the wind. Very difficult. And it's interesting, is drum, is that typical Italian for describing the purr of a cat?
No, it's not really. Their purr would be, in modern Italian.
She's imitating the purr of her cat. She says it's purr.
Exactly. And it's so funny because, if another moment in which it's just, people talking about, their things, their regular life, and she's talking about, her dream house and about her cat, this wonderful moment in which the cat is purring, right?
Right. And what's significant, it says a lot about who this character is. At the end of the aria, she's talking about the cat's philosophy, which is rather be the master in a hovel, than be a servant in a mansion. And she has beforehand, and she has her thing. She's a bag lady, and so she has in her bag beef hearts that she's going to give her cat for dinner. And the line, I think, toward the end of the aria is, rather eat 2 halves of the heart than have your heart be broken. And she comes up with these things, And so she is the ray of light in the show.
She's one of the few, I would say. Yeah. But let's see, this is one of the other moments, which, let's see Giorgetta and Luigi.
Il nostro sport, il nostro mondo, noi non possiamo vivere sull'acqua, bisogna calpestare il marciapiede. Là c'è una casa, là ci sono amici, festosi incontri e piene confidenze.
Ci si conosce tutti, c'è tutti una famiglia.
Al mattino il lavoro che ci aspetta, alla sera i ritorni in comitiva. Botteghe che s'accendono di luce e di lusinghe, pitture che si incrociano, domeniche chiassose. Piccole gite nue al bosco di Boulogne, bagni all'aperto, intimità amorosa. È difficile dire cosa sia.
That's one of those, this is what Italian opera is about, moments. And if Puccini had been writing it 20 years before, it would have been this extended 5-minute duet. But he just wasn't interested. Yeah. He wanted only those 60 seconds of this incredible emotional outpouring before the drama proceeded.
And it's such a contrast, because this is really the moment almost that says, okay, this is the first part is almost over, and what's going to contrast is coming right after with the next duet, which is completely different. I mean, it's two different moments in life. This is the moment in which Giorgetta and Luigi show us first that they have something happening because they have this link, having been grown in Belleville, in this neighborhood of Paris, both of them. Yet we don't know how far this went, if it's an actual relationship until the next duet. The next duet is so much darker.
What I love though, in that the solo section for her, before that little duet passage begins, is she says, it's difficult to say it's difficult to describe this strange anxiety, this nostalgia, and he puts her very quietly in the middle of her voice until she takes that high C, which is on the word nostalgia, and it just brings it home. It creates, in a very compact way, it creates you get the inner being of this very troubled young woman. And it just showed how far he was going, how far he had come psychologically in presenting characters that really had a lot of stuff going on inside.
Yeah.
You know, she is a very complex character, and he got her. He got her in that whole section so beautifully.
Absolutely, a gorgeous moment. And the next one is completely the opposite.
Yes.
Let's see, and this is right after almost, in terms of, few little things happen, and then we have an actual almost because the one before it's sort of we have also said that in this opera there's not really scenes, moments, real arias and things, except for probably Nola's in it.
Yeah, but this is really dialogue rather than a duet, because they don't really sing together at all.
They don't. Yeah, they don't. Let's see what happens.
Hai le scarpe di corda.
Sì, fai lo stesso segnale.
Sì. I fiammifero acceso, come tremava sul braccio mio teso, la piccola fiammella mi pareva d'accendere una stella, fiamma del nostro amore, stella senza tramonto.
Io voglio la tua bocca, voglio le tue carezze.
Perché tu lo senti, foglia del desiderio.
Foglia di gelosia, vorrei tenerti stretta come una cosa mia. Vorrei non più soffrirla più quanto ti confesse, e per sottrarre tutti il corpo a tua divina. Io te lo giuro, non trema.
That's got to be the most difficult music, most difficult 30 seconds of music for a tenor in all of Puccini.
Absolutely. All over
It's
there.
excruciating. I mean, he really wasn't being very kind. What's so interesting is that the first Luigi at the Met in 1918 was an Italian tenor named Giulio Primi, who sang Manrico and Trovatore as his professional debut, and debuted at the Met as Radames and Aida. But he sang this, and then he sang Rinuccio in the first Gianni Schicchi, which nowadays is sung by light lyric tenors most of the time. So he must have had an amazing control of his
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's such a powerful moment also. It brings us back, to his reality. I mean, he says, I will cut in your throat and make you jewels with, with your blood. That with his blood. Would you think, about Puccini saying something like that 20 years earlier? I mean, when the most dramatic thing would be will be the dream. So this has become really such a powerful and realistic moment.
And the audience must have been completely shocked.
Completely. I totally agree. I mean, besides the fact that all of this, all of the drama happens here, because in the moment in which she light the fiammifero, the match, is the moment that will be the signal, the end of the opera practically. Because what happens next? So once after they finish the duet, Michele comes back, right?
Because back then Giorgetta and Michele had
their
dialogue.
Exactly. Oh, yes. And then after the dialogue, which tells us so much about what happened, that really the mother of the story.
Yes.
Then let's see how it's going on.
Tutte queste storie che a me non interessano.
Perché non m'ami più? Perché?
Sbagli, amo, tu sei buono e onesto, ora andiamo a dormire.
Tu non dormi!
Lo sai perché non dormo e poi là dentro soffoco. Non posso.
Ora le notti son tanto fresche e l'anno scorso là in quel nero guscio eravamo pur tre. C'era il lettuccio del nostro bimbo.
Il nostro bimbo, taci.
Tu sporgevi la mano e lo cullavi dolcemente, lentamente, poi sul braccio mio t'addormentavi.
Non dir niente.
Erano sere come queste, se spirava la brezza.
Such a heartbreaking
It
moment.
is, and this is a moment that really tests the baritone because he's right on. Those are E's, aren't they? Above the set, and he has to sing them beautifully. He has to take these legato lines with real control, and he also, at the same time, has to bring so much out of himself. So finally, we're understanding where he's coming from emotionally.
It's the first moment he really speaks about all of the drama that we never about this kid that they lost the year before. She doesn't want to talk about it.
No.
Now the situation is inverted. At the beginning, he was the one that didn't want to talk. And in the moment in which we know the reason for that silence, for that crisis between the two of them, she's the one that says, taci. Because she cannot stand exactly the pain thinking about this thing.
It was fairly effortful listening to Tito Gobbi sing that, but at the same time, you got the agony from him. So in a way, the effortfulness of the singing sort of helped, because it just accentuated how completely pained he is at this moment.
And which brings to the next moment, right?
No, se proprio questa sera voleva abbandonarmi e m'ha fatto preghiera di sbarcarlo a ruolo. Ma chi dunque, chi sarà squarciare le tenebre, vedere serrarlo così tra le mani e gridargli sei tu, e gridargli sei tu, il tuo volto livido torneva alla mia pena, sei tu, vieni con me questa catena, accomoda la mia
but he's probably pushing at least 60, maybe older, and he still had
At least.
ID.
Yes.
Yeah.
Phenomenal.
It was.
There was Federico Puccini, one of the great Italian baritons.
Yes. That's an amazing monologue vocally because he basically has to cover 2 full octaves. It's a low G.
It's low G.
Yeah. Very difficult. And it starts fairly intimately. And it builds to this extraordinary climax. You have to have a real arc in it. And you also have to register. I mean, Puccini is all about line-by-line response to the text. And you can't sing Puccini if you don't have that. So this monologue is a real test of that ability, I think.
It is. And all of that, this drama, this question again, over and over. He starts questioning, tries to know who's going to be, who must be, the lover of his wife. So we imagine all the drama, thinking who might have been, the people that he knows.
It's this guy.
This is guy that start to think about everybody. And yet, this is just, the beginning of the end, and it's just after this, practically the big moment happens, right?
That Luigi steals onto the barge and is strangled by the
Right. And all of that, as I was saying before, it's ignited by the fact that the opera starts with Giorgetta making fun, also somehow noticing that Michele's pipe doesn't work anymore, right? And besides the double entendre there's also this idea that the opera ends with Michele actually lighting his pipe.
That's the signal.
And when Michele lights his pipe, Luigi thinks that is the signal by Giorgetta, and he comes in. And that's where Michele understands that Luigi is the one. And isn't that incredible? I think that, as we were saying before, there's such an arch. As we were saying before, from the silence of Michele to the silence of Giorgetta, from the pipa, from the pipe that is not, lit at the beginning, to the pipe that becomes the signal, to practically generate the tragedy. And finally, to this big moment in which, Michele, makes Luigi confess, kills Luigi, and he puts Luigi under his cloak, which is the same cloak that Michele, just a second before, told us that he was using, to embrace his Giorgetta and the child. So, it's such a, there's such a magistry, such a mastery, driving these big lines, and I don't know, how, if you were to sum all this opera in a few words, what is that, you would think that, would tell us in a few words what Puccini wanted to tell us with it?
He gave us emotions that are so true. That was the most important thing, to communicate emotion through conversation and also through lyricism, when lyricism was the right vehicle. And to also, at the same time, to create a physical world which was believable to the audience, in which this drama could unfold. He does all of that, and he does it in less than an hour. It's a brilliant achievement.
It's incredible, isn't it? All right, I really appreciate, Roger, helping us, through this, understanding of this wonderful masterwork. And I really hope, that, the Opera Festival of Chicago is going to be able, to bring this work back to life soon. I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I would like, to invite Robert Massi, our General Director, to just say goodbye and close the night. In the meantime, thank you so much from myself and from Roger Pines, a wonderful guest. Thank you, Roger.
Well, that was a great, thank you, Roger Pines, thank you, Emanuele Andrizzi. Thank you to the Italian Cultural Institute of Chicago and Roosevelt University and all of our viewers. I'd also like to special thanks to our donors who help us bring Italian opera to Chicago and the Midwest. If you'd like to join us in bringing this music to life, please visit our website, operafestivalchicago.org. Due to the restrictions on gatherings in the state of Illinois, our presentation of El Tabarro that was scheduled for December 21st will be pushed into the spring. When we have those dates, we'll release them on social media and our website. I know after tonight, we're all really excited to see that. So again, on behalf of the entire Opera Festival of Chicago family, thank you for watching and thank you for sharing this video.